Hello, everyone. My name is Zachariah Samuel, and I'm a MS1 at the CUNY School of Medicine.
My name is Amar. I'm a senior at Case Western.
And welcome to the MSX podcast, a show about a broad range of topics in medicine, from education to exploring research and contemplating future directions for the field. In each episode, we speak with leaders in the field to learn from their insight and expertise.
This week, we have Dr. Saumitra Thakur, a physician and venture capitalist. He completed medical school at NYU and business school at Stanford GSB. He currently works at CPMC in San Francisco as a hospitalist and Med Mountain Ventures, a fund which he helped to create. Thanks for joining us.
Hey guys, awesome to be here.
Yeah, and so we'd love to start by exploring your story from the beginning. And your story includes being in school for a significant portion of time. I'd love to learn what type of student you were in high school and in college.
Totally. I was always a huge nerd. I spent a lot of time in high school doing speech and debate. I spent a lot of time in college doing student government, which was so incredibly unpopular that people would often win elections by getting 10 votes, 15 votes as a write-in the night before. And I thoroughly enjoyed both. They had no relevant exposure for anything I did professionally, but it was a lot of fun. I was a sort of careless and meandering student. I went to a liberal arts school that had no requirements and a lot of freedom. And I definitely think that I was not mature enough to handle that. So I spent a whole bunch of time taking, classes like, independent studies on Buddhism and physics, and an unusual number of classes on, the philosophy of science and religion. It was all very fun. I don't know if I draw, I don't think I draw on it very often. I enjoyed it. And my wife says I'm good at cocktail parties as a result. I can make a lot of small talk.
Do you have an interesting minor then?
So I did neuroscience as my major. I think the thing that I really appreciate, I think the classes that ended up being super helpful were taking a discrete mathematics class that later on, when I took some machine learning classes for fun, was just super, super helpful. I found that very revealing. I found that taking a lot of advanced science classes that focused heavily on journal club formats was probably the line of thinking that I use the most as a VC now. And it also was probably the line of thinking that made the really stressful part of med school and residency a lot easier. And I think the most surprising thing is I took this intro anthropology class that talked a lot about human interaction, human norms, and the anthropology of money and gifts, which I think was mysteriously incredibly useful and practical. It was probably the most practical class that I took in college, which definitely I would not have thought about at the time.
Interesting. So actually my class registration is coming up on Monday. So I'm kind of choosing my last semester of my last year in college, classes. So for students that are still in college now, what are maybe a few classes you'd highly recommend they should take?
I think that it depends a lot on where you are. You can often have the same material taught at different places. And with a really luminary person, it's you learn something really cool. And elsewhere, it's very lame. I had an ecology professor who taught ecology with a very rigorous microeconomic framework. And despite never taking microeconomics, when I later took it at Stanford, it felt very familiar because I saw all of it before in ecology and it made sense. And this guy was a luminary. He was one of the best professors I had. In my experience, I'm so glad that I took that random ecology class for fun. But it would be, I think, foolish of me to recommend for you, Amar, to go take an ecology class, because there's a good chance you'd spend the entire time just drawing pyramids and food chains and stuff. It was a pleasant surprise. But I think that oftentimes classes are useful not because of what they teach, but the underlying framework they give. And it's usually luminary professors who can transmit not just knowledge, but, a style of thinking. So this way down the road, it's it's not OChem per se, but it was that one OChem professor who taught you a fundamental framework of thinking.
So diving deep into that, framework of thinking, what were some of those quintessential lessons you learned, let's say in college specifically?
I think that there were a few things that I really appreciated. Student government was a very good example of seeing how a really well-run academic institution worked on the inside. It was interesting to see how an organization that was ostensibly like a very idealistic and principled organization ran also incredibly efficiently. And you see these people who could both be like a force for good, but also have a certain rigor in how they ran their institution and pulled it off really well. I think about that a lot in healthcare because we want to both like run really good organizations, but we also usually, especially like doctors, want to build aspirational organizations. It's like not about making money, it's about caring for folks, doing the right thing, doing good. It's very hard to pull that off. The reason I think most doctors hate their jobs is that usually their jobs like don't really like run very well, or they don't really dignify and value humans. So in college, seeing how like a university balanced that, I found that really revealing. Anthropology taught me a lot about norms, things that go unstated. And this comes up a lot because especially the way we view startups, whenever you hear people say, I like that person when I first saw them, or like, this founder has a certain charisma. A lot of that has to do with people who send very subtle signals, sort of signal in a very primal way, like I'm in your in-group, I belong. I think it's why VC investment has been very singular, why we tend to invest in people who look like us to a fault. Being attuned to those kinds of biases was very liberating because it helped me deliberately source way beyond just my in-group, sort of look everywhere for deals. It ended up serving me really well as a VC. And then on the flip side, when I've been raising money, I noticed that I often have to pretend to be a certain person, look a certain way, talk a certain way, send certain signals when I'm raising money from folks who are sort of like, very traditionally wealthy, come from like a very particular background. These are hard things to just understand and process on a personal level. And it was interesting to get like a very high level anthropological view of, how do people relate to each other? What are all of these like densely textual interactions that we have that where so much goes unspoken that you don't really understand if you just look at what's obvious.
We can transition going into like medical school. And I was wondering, because a lot of people talk about how the transition from college to med school is very difficult. So I was wondering, like, what areas of growth did you identify in yourself going from college into med school?
Totally. Med school is tough. I would recommend keep an open mind and fail quickly and try all kinds of things. It felt like the Olympics of studying. And, Zach, you're going through this, this. It's so intense. Like, every part of medical training makes everything before it seem like a joke, which seems crazy, but it's like college was hard. And then you go through like MS1 and you're like, whoa, like this. And then you do and then you're like literally falling asleep on your feet, like, like MS3, you're doing a surgery rotation, like sleeping a couple hours a night, like, like scared to urinate because you're scrubbed in for 6 hours. And you're like, suddenly it wasn't so bad sitting in the library for 12 hours being like, hey, I'm going to go eat lunch. Like I can go on my own terms and I can sit down during the day. Every part of medical training makes the part before it look easy. I think that the most important thing is try a whole bunch of stuff, keep an open mind. If your method of studying and working isn't working, that's cool. Like that's fine. Try something else. And if it works for someone else, doesn't mean that it's going to work for you. So keep an open mind. The other thing I'd toss out is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. The folks who really gunned hard, very classically, they tend to self-combust at some point. Like the people who sort of don't have a balance are like too intense or also very interpersonally toxic. Inevitably, that backfires on them at some point. The folks who ended up being the most successful year after year were the folks who could show up consistently, who tended to turn toward people, pull up the people around them, not put them down, but also were very balanced. Like they had lives, they had things they cared about outside of like surviving the next test. And they had like the endurance to show up and do, the like many grueling things to finish med school, finish residency, possibly finish like fellowship and sub fellowship.
And you mentioned also that you had a lot of interest, during college, during your undergrad. I was wondering how many of them were able to translate, or if you were able to keep up with them during med school, if any.
I had a startup totally unrelated to healthcare when I was in med school. I fell into this startup that built movements for famous people, former heads of state, Nobel laureates, tech icons, etc. It was very cool and very flashy, but it had no immediate medical relevance. It was really tough. I had a whole bunch of people say, you're not publishing papers, you're not doing these things. You can't, you're closing a bunch of doors. You can't do a subspecialty surgical field, et cetera. Like if you're not like focused on that from day one. So it's okay to make trade-offs, but you should make sure that you know that you're doing them. I definitely was less productive as a researcher. I got a couple papers. I did a few like posters. But I definitely could have done, 2 or 3 times more if I wasn't also chasing that stuff. So I think that I probably overdid it. The people who did it better were people who probably did it maybe 25, 50% less than me and focused more on other things. It also took a really big personal effect. Like I didn't have a lot of time for friends, for my relationship, for my health. It constantly felt like, one thing or the other was on fire. So I don't think I did that part particularly well. I think you can definitely balance interests outside of medicine when in medical school and still have time to show up and do really well.
So I'm sensing a common theme of like hard work and resilience. What was something that really, was the light at the end of the tunnel, or what you were chasing for?
Early on, I wasn't sure. I felt like I was just like showing up and like running really hard and working myself into a frenzy, being like, other folks are killing it. I got to kill it. I got to show up. The startup that I worked on in med school, the one that did stuff in politics, it ultimately ended up imploding. And that setback was actually very liberating. Like it was very maturing. I ended up realizing, I'd rather work on something that I love. I'd really rather pursue things that are like honestly interesting to me. And I'm just going to say no to things that aren't. And I went back to med school. I had like the best year of med school ever. I picked up research projects that I thought were fun. And anytime I was like on service and an attending was like, oh, why don't you write this up as a case? I'd just be very honest. And I'm like, I don't find this interesting. Like, I don't find this interesting, and it's not like a good use of my time professionally. You should totally write it up. I'm happy to recommend another med student to do it. I similarly, when I was previously trying to do startup stuff, I was like, I'm gonna try to go as big, as hard, et cetera. And when I came back, I was like, I just want to do cool stuff. I want to do meaningful stuff with people I like, founders I like, partners I like. And I didn't think I would enjoy VC, but I found my stride. I think that having the courage to be honest and to be like, I don't enjoy this, I don't like these people, I don't like this workflow, was very liberating. My friends who burned out like later in their medical careers usually lied to themselves about what they were doing. And then they would hit several years into like a field which is very prestigious, but like not right for them. And they were very unhappy. So I feel fortunate that I got that lesson when I did.
A question about forming Med Mountain Ventures, why did you think that you needed to form a fund rather than join one? Like, what was something that was missing?
Totally. This is a great question. You make an omelet with the stuff that you find in your fridge. In the same way, I was in residency. I had someone who I helped out with his company who had exited his company. He started investing. We had a very serendipitous path. He hit me up and he said, would you like to invest with me? And originally I said, I'm not sure if I would enjoy VC. I'm happy to collaborate. I don't know if I would do it full time, but, keep me in mind. He later on, unexpectedly, he was a young guy. He was 40 at the time. He had a subarachnoid hemorrhage. He had a hemorrhagic stroke. He was disabled for several months. And during that time, he asked me to run his fund while he recovered. And I really enjoyed it. So he came back. Fortunately, he's okay. In the journey, he met our third GP, Caitlin, who's also a rock star. We ended up really loving working together, really liking each other, and hitting a stride with the deals we were finding. I would say that starting a fund is incredibly hard. We would all have probably made way more money and saved a bunch of time and had much nicer things if we just joined existing funds. The way it worked out, it made sense for us to do it on our own, and we found a lot of joy doing it. But it was definitely the harder, less sensible thing to do.
So going off of that, I was wondering if you had any general frameworks or advice for students that are trying to do similar things by exploring interdisciplinary careers in healthcare.
Totally. I would say this. I used to think that there was a path to go down and, a right way to do it, because everything in healthcare has a right way. You want to be an orthopedic surgeon, there's a way to do that. There's a scorecard. You want to do plastics, that's cool. There's a way to do that. And I kept meeting people who did cool careers who similarly were like, do this, do that. There's no single right path. The most useful thing is to bring something to the table that you know really well and to collaborate out all of the things that you don't know. And you can learn those things over time, through collaboration. It's kind of like how sometimes the best research groups, you've got a bunch of domain experts in this domain and then a handful of people from others. You've got your biostatistician, you have your machine learning person, maybe you have a bench biochemist or something. And it's the sort of friction of people with different backgrounds collaborating to solve something that really lights a fire. I would say to anyone exploring an interdisciplinary career, keep an open mind. I would probably recommend against getting a joint degree unless you have a very clear need for it. I would instead say double down on the things that you love. If you really love a certain kind of medicine or a topic or a technology, double down. It's easy to find opportunities to get exposure. You can just call it research, and as long as you publish something on it, you can get covered to spend a lot of your time in medical school, developing those skill sets. If you do a joint degree, make it very targeted, have a very clear thesis for how it helps you. Your university will totally upsell the degree to you because they make so much money with people getting additional degrees that they take out loans to finance. So if you do it, don't trust your university, make sure it clearly adds value to you, and don't oversweat it. Don't think that you need a credential or a license or permission to show up to the table and start contributing. If there's something interdisciplinary that you want to do, feel free to reach out to the people who are doing those kinds of things now and collaborate in whatever capacity you can. These things develop, over time, show up wherever you are, and you will find out the skills you need to grow.
Humans are really bad at guessing what they want to do. And so where does the balance come from, from saying no to an experience without having tried it and just saying yes and trying out the experience?
It's a good question. Another way to frame this is, when do you explore and when do you exploit? I think that if everyone is in a different stage, I'm constantly surprised by people who are the same age as me, who've had ostensibly the same lived experience as me, who are totally different in terms of their interest in exploring or exploiting. There are a lot of people who are really unhappy with what they're doing, and they're very curious about things that they've never tried before, and they kind of want to be more in an explore phase. And I've met other people who have been living, in many domains, doing many different kinds of things. And finally, they're instead of doing 5 things, I found one thing that I really want to do. There's no right answer. It's always worth keeping an open mind. When I decided to focus less on exploring and more on exploiting, it was very clear that my pendulum had swung too far to one side. And when I started doubling down and being I'm just going to focus on these few things, more wood behind fewer arrows, it worked out really well. I suddenly did a lot better at the things I wanted to do. And I was also much happier, and I had way more time, and it felt like the right decision for me. The we never get clean answers for how to make these trade-offs. A very fair way to deal with an uncertain world, and it's the same thing that we do in the ICU when we're trying to evoke a physiology and do critical care, is take a step and see how it goes and collect data and see if your theory is correct. If you think that exploring is right for you, that keeping an open mind, saying yes, and taking on a wide variety of things is what's going to be important for you right now, try it out. And if you end up being like, my mind really expanded, I ran into some really cool things, like, that's cool. Double down, keep it going. And if you're like, my leads suck, like, I really love that one thing, and everything else I found, it's like very clear that that one thing is like, my jam. Like, that's cool. Then, you collected data, you tried it out, try out the other thing now, try doubling down on that and seeing how you go. It's noisy. There's no easy answer, but there are definitely better and worse ways to do it.
I thought that explore versus exploit idea, I think that's like I've never heard that phrase that way before. That was really cool.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Amar, you can take the next one.
Sure. So I do want to talk about now, like, future pipe dreams and medicine. So what does the future physician look like?
I think that it depends. I think that for every field, it'll mean different things. For surgeons, I think that it's going to be doing fewer surgeries, doing the same surgery over and over as much as you can. The signal is there that, the over generalist surgeon does a lot worse. Like, the person who only does one procedure over and over again, does a lot better. And I think that this will make that feel like those fields higher performing, but possibly much more dreary. I suspect that's the direction that's going to go. For a lot of fields where work can be task shifted, where instead of the physician doing it, someone else could do it with really good supervision, I think that we're going to see a flurry of attempts to do that. Some will be better and some will be worse. Probably a few will be really good and many will be terrible. A lot of this will be, and it'll be interesting to see how technology shapes that. It'll be a lot of it's hard to go from one physician to 0 physicians, but it's very easy to go from 10 radiologists caring for 100 patients to 4 radiologists caring for 100 patients with either technology or task shifted labor, scaling those 4 physicians to provide the same level of care. That'll be a story over and over again. And the final part is, we have no real market for healthcare in this country. It's entirely prices and costs that are dictated by government policy. And the winds will blow in different directions. In fields that will make a lot of money will make very little. In fields that pay really poorly will make a lot. This happened over and over again. You keep hearing about how, reimbursement will change. Then suddenly, like, radiation oncology is like super hot or it's not, or PM&R is super hot or it's not. That trend will continue, but I suspect that there's going to be increasing pressure pushing down specialist salaries, because this country is going to go bankrupt by how much it's spending on healthcare. And that's going to be low-hanging fruit to go after.
Is there a problem with, like, the latency period of technology innovation in healthcare, where you have, like, some amazing biotech advance, but it can't be implemented within the first, like, at mass scale within the first 10 years? And once it is, then after 10 years, there's like a new med device. From what I understand, like, technology and knowledge, especially in like the medical field, is exponential because they keep building off each other. So is there like some implications with that latency period, and how might we fix that?
I'll tell you the framework that I like to use to think about this. Every system, whether a company or a country, or even universities, student clubs, every institution has to make a trade-off between maximizing upside potential and minimizing downside risk. The corporate example is, you could have a company that's like, shoot for the fences, take a bunch of risks. Like, if you get like a 1000x better product, like, that's cool. And we're willing to fail over and over again for that chance. Other companies are like, we can't mess up. Every single thing has to be perfect. We can't take any risk. Keep your head down, keep it going, play it safe. I'll talk about what we do and then what we should do. What we do in this country is we have a healthcare system which is very geared towards minimize downside risk. Like make it so that people are as safe as possible in the healthcare system using existing ways of doing things, because those are the things that we really know. So change very slowly, set like an incredibly high bar for something new. In contrast, medical systems where the legacy system is greatly overwhelmed and fledgling are very much like, upside potential. So you'll hear about very clever AI diagnostics that will be mired for a long time in the FDA here, but that will be like, you'll see like a similar group doing product launch in India with like very little scrutiny, getting, very far ahead very quickly. And it's because one system is very much like, we can't take risk. Because, and like, our system, as bad as it is, like, people aren't dropping dead, like we can't tolerate like putting lives at risk to get quick innovation. Whereas other countries are like, our system is so far behind that we really need, these kinds of miracles. We're very open to trying. So at a societal level, we've made a trade-off where we're very risk averse when we come to healthcare. I think that that's, in a really broad sense, fair. It's probably the right thing to do for us right now. What's inexcusable is that this larger culture of being very averse to change often resists when change is actually not very risky and very straightforward. So for example, you'll see changes in guideline-directed medical therapy for a condition, and they'll say, people who have like these criteria, if you give them this drug, they will live a lot longer. But then when you go to prescribe it, you find yourself suddenly mired by like an insurance company that's like very skeptical of this and very hostile to it. And it's very, very difficult to do. You see a lot of lag between when guidelines are like, we just discovered this is the best way to care for heart failure patients. And you look at a huge population and it's like, the vast majority of people are not getting appropriate guideline-directed medical therapy for that condition. I think that mindful that the larger trade-off that we've made is the right trade-off, that kind of friction is a like unambiguous harm. And our system is worse off because of it. It's a surprisingly hard problem to fix because all of the incentives in our healthcare system make no sense, including as long as you have a really big fee-for-service component in so many different parts of your value chain, it's very hard to motivate people with like a altruistic goal of giving the best care. The other hard part is that information is so incredibly vast now that people are just way behind. Like they're like drowning in information. The average primary care physician in this country is remarkably old, and a shocking number of them have outside of the bare minimum to keep their medical license, like have not been picking up medical textbooks and, staying up to date with what, like the ACC, AHA published a few years ago.
Are there any companies that are trying to make it easier to just keep updated on medical knowledge?
I saw one recently. So in brief, I think that up to date, if that's all that happened, is a huge step forward. I love the fact that it has improved everyone's game so much. Like, I love the fact that it's like a household name, like everywhere I've trained, even if it's something super routine, like community acquired pneumonia, people are like, oh yeah, let me just like double check up to date to make sure I'm doing the right thing, which is awesome. It's not a fancy solution. It's basically like, very 1990s execution, and that's fine. Like people are doing it and I love that. EHRs are really powerful ways to have like a really profound way to nudge behavior by doing things like ordering. If you search antibiotics, like the first antibiotic you see versus the second, like small decisions like that have profound impact at scale. And there's a lot of room for good to do very clever human design hacks in your EHR to nudge behavior at scale. And it's like literally as simple as there's like two kinds of vitamin D tests. One we order all the time for everyone, and one we order for working up very esoteric kinds of metabolic derangements. And like in the past, people used to constantly order the wrong one, which is super expensive and very slow. And medical systems realize that they just put in parentheses, like, you probably don't want to order this one, like you want to order that one. like shockingly that like reduced misordering by like 90%. Like it had really profound impacts. So very clever hacks in the way we consume information often have really profound impact. It could be as simple as nudging people to be like, hey, by the way, in this hospital stay, this person had a diagnosis of AFib. Like in even the most frail elderly patients, this like very large number of people would benefit from being on anticoagulation. You didn't order one, like, seriously consider ordering one before they go home. Small nudge, just a box, just like a flag, you click through it. Those things, when done well, can be very good. When done poorly, they tend to saturate people and people will just tune them all out.
So talking about EHR specifically, I was wondering what your take was on the future of clinical research with the widespread adoption of Epic and any potential for cross-institutional collaborations with all this data that they have.
Totally. There's a very good pressure from the government in this country to stop information blocking at all levels, so that providers can see records from other hospitals, so that patients can access their own medical records. At every step of the way, really large institutions will do everything they can to block as much information flow as they can legally and to make it as frictional, expensive, and tedious as possible. The other hard part is that a lot of information that's in the structured health record is total garbage, like how we bill for conditions, et cetera, when we submit billings is shockingly arbitrary. So I think that there's going to be a lot of data collaboration. There are a couple companies that I'm following. A lot of these companies I think would actually be really cool for anyone interested to keep an eye on, that are looking at how do we look at large, huge sets of data, either within a system or across systems. There's this really big interest in the clinical trial community to do disseminated clinical trials or to do synthetic control arms. So if you have a really rare condition, if you have like a population of a few hundred or a few thousand who have your condition like in the entire US, it's very hard to do a really well-designed synthetic control arm because it's so easy for it to be confounded by all kinds of things. But a very rigorous team of data scientists working with enough data, controlling for as many things as possible, can do a solidly decent job. And when it's the difference between, there may not be enough people alive to power your study to solve catastrophic condition, that could be a game changer. So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening with real world efficacy and real world evidence to change how we do trials, how we really see, when we launch a drug, how does it actually perform? Are weird side effects happening we may not have picked up on over time? I think back on how it took us a long time to realize that like a large number of Asians don't metabolize Plavix, and it just like doesn't work on them. And in hindsight, if we had better trials early on, we would have picked up on that, but we totally didn't. And for a long time, so many Asians who were put on DAPT ended up having, catastrophic strokes that could have been avoided, catastrophic heart attacks. We found that out later. And when we found that out later, it was, a really bad look for medicine. And the hope is that with companies like this, there are all kinds of, other Plavixes and other populations. And it's going to be fascinating to figure out, it turns out this drug is actually better than that drug. We never did a head-to-head. It turns out like this drug doesn't work in this context. We just presumed it did.
So given your venture capitalist, I'm sure you read 0 to 1. And so you might know the question I really want to ask. What is one thing that you believe to be true that very few people agree with you on?
It's a good question. This is a good question. I think that I have a lot of contrarian beliefs. I think that the biggest is more important than actually getting better for humans is having a really strong subjective experience of being cared for, and understanding that very fundamental need and respecting it as something you have to reckon with will make a huge difference in whether your healthcare intervention is successful or not. I would give the example of homeopathy and Ayurvedic medicines. I went to an Ayurvedic hospital in India one time. Everyone was super happy. Everyone was like, like so blown away. The facilities were beautiful. They were filled with art. They gave you all of this attention. I think every single one of the therapies that they offered were totally bogus and had no medical merit, but the patients were incredibly happy. And it was weird because I'm used to being in hospitals where I have literally magical medicines that will save people's lives and no one is happy. Or you go to Walgreens and you pick up your meds and, it's not like a very pleasant experience, but those medicines work. We know they work. We know how they work. They're like pretty cool stuff. You go to a homeopathic pharmacy, not to cast shade on homeopathy as well. I'm casting a lot of shade right now, but the homeopathic medicines will, like, by all means not work, but the homeopathic pharmacist will give you such a wonderful, dignifying sense of being cared about. They will spend so much time talking to you. When I lived in this when I had a very small, like, medical resident apartment in this very posh part of Santa Monica, the homeopathic pharmacies would always be busy all the time. People thoroughly love them, like well-educated people who, have a lot of sophistication, truly appreciated it. It's because they got a sense of being cared for. If you can do that with a product that doesn't actually create value, imagine what you could do if you have a product that actually works and you create the same experience.
I was curious, like, why do you think that, like, the allopathic school of thought has, maybe lost touch with that sense of care, in your opinion?
I would say a few things. I think that the pathway we have to create physicians is strongly selects for certain factors that ultimately become reinforcing over generations and over a long time. They become so fundamental to the field that the field can't see that it does it. I've seen so many professors who are nationally acclaimed, medical ethicists, medical humanities, luminaries, who I see at the bedside do incredibly callous, mean, sort of careless things. And they seem to lack the self-awareness to understand, how they come off to patients. They certainly know what they should be doing when you hear them talk, when you hear them publish, when you hear them teach, when you hear them write books, et cetera. It sends a very different message from how they practice. And if those people can still have, moments that are just like so blindsided, you can imagine what like the rest of us, the normal people, the humans are like day to day. I think that our pathway is so weird. We never hold real jobs. We often come from very siloed backgrounds. It's often like healthcare families going into healthcare. We're often like younger, healthier. We may not have like directly suffered with disease immediately. I think a lot of these things really erode like a common kind of empathy and compassion. I didn't realize until I started attending that I only meet people as a hospitalist on their like the worst day of their lives. Like every single time I do an admission, it's just like, it's like my whatever, like third admission for the day. Like for me, it's just a normal day, but it's like for every single person and usually for their loved ones, it's like the worst day of their lives. And they're, genuinely terrified. They probably don't have like, even like their clothes or their phone charger, and they're scared they're going to die. And if they're not scared they're going to die, almost everyone is terrified of the medical bill they're going to get. And like reflecting on that, I thought was really transformative for me. I think a lot of people have moments like that in their own practice, but even though we see it in med school, even though every med school says that they value this kind of like compassion and humanity, for some reason in our system, it's just not, it's still not, I think, as prominent as where it could be.
I think now we're nearing the end, so I'd love to ask for like any final piece of advice for students that are interested in healthcare, interdisciplinary careers in healthcare, or just entering the job force in general.
Totally. Your differences are what makes you unique. Our field is filled with so many people who have excellent traditional scorecards. Their actual grades are amazing. Their publications are amazing. They, check off all of the boxes. It's usually the frictions that make people fascinating. It's the people who are pre-med, who never major in the sciences, who major in history or writing or something else, who have something to say. It's the people who have, like an economics background or a math background or CS background who show up, who are suddenly very fascinating to all kinds of research groups that are like, we have a bunch of med students who have like traditional pre-med classes, but it's cool that you can write in Python, or it's cool that you know how to do like difference in difference, analysis and, econometrics for like outcomes research. All of the thing, or like, it's cool that you like read books and you write beautiful essays and you connect with and share your experiences, these like human experiences that you experience in the hospital, in the written word. You should lean into the things that make you weird. There are, whatever those things are, there's some subset out there within healthcare where it could give you really strong grounds to stand in. I'm blown away by the number of people who I know who are, really sincere, like extreme running enthusiasts who are now doing like sports medicine, and they love the fact that they get to hang out with, athletes on race day for like ultra marathons and volunteer and provide, like medical first aid for those. And it's like a really cool way to marry the thing that they spent their entire life doing that they love with a field of healthcare that they get to do. You can do it with almost any interest. You can find some way to combine the two in an interesting way that makes you richer for it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thakur, for joining us. And this has been the MSX podcast.